very exciting speakers for you. And the first one is Brian Arthur. Brian has been a key person in the rapidly evolving world of complexity since the early days of the Santa Fe Institute. In fact, he's one of the founding fathers of the Institute, and the father of what's now generally called the general, what is generally seen as the new general theory of economics, namely complexity economics. I've known Brian since 2006, when we were setting up the Institute Paralimes in Europe. His experience with the Santa Fe Institute played a key role in the successful start of that Institute Paralimes. That start was abruptly broken off when the financial crisis hit in 2009 and funding for the institute dried up almost instantly. But the ideas for such an institute did not disappear, and thanks to Su Guaning and to Bertel Anderson, we had another chance at NTU. Brian, of course, played a key role in preparing the grounds at the NTU for the complexity program that started in 2011. And after that, in 2014, in helping shape Paralimes at NTU, following the launch of the Complexity Institute. So you can imagine that it is with great pleasure and gratitude that I ask Brian to come on stage, and I ask you to help me welcome him.
Thank you, Jan. Well, I'm delighted to be here and see so many people I care about and know. Thank you all for coming. I want to start in a very particular place and time, and that is in Los Alamos. It's a very small town near Santa Fe, New Mexico, up on the mesa. And I was visiting a museum there. It could have been about 20 years ago. I showed up at this museum. I think I was on my own. It's a tiny little museum dedicated to this time around in the 1940s when Los Alamos was developing weapons. And by the way, I'm not trying to glorify Los Alamos. It was about 10 years after that I spent time in Nagasaki. And that brought a lot of realities home to me very personally. But what caught my eye in this tiny little museum in Los Alamos is that it had, by some magic, it transported you back to the 1940s. It wasn't very well laid out. They had military uniforms were there. Jeff might know this tiny place. There were only 3 or 4 rooms. But you could see pictures and photographs of jeeps, of military police, slide rules, theoretical things written in hand. Some were typed, permissions, ration books. And within about half a minute, I just felt I was back in the 1940s, for better or worse, in this place, Los Alamos. And it triggered this idea in my mind, maybe a rather silly idea. I wondered, suppose I walked outside and by some magic, it's a thought experiment, so we can do what we want. By some magic, there were jeeps, there were military police. It might have been 1995 or whenever this happened, but I'd walk outside and the streets would be the same as before. The military vehicles would be there. People would be fishing slide rules out of their pockets and so on. Some magic like that. And their ideas would be the ideas of the 1940s, and the rest of the world somehow would either disappear in this kind of Brigadoon type of setup. Would I be back in the 40s? This was my question. It's a question really, it's a philosophical question. If you could rearrange everything to replicate a particular time, if you believe that there's a universal clock, but set everything up to be the same as before, would that replicate that particular era. There's another way to put this, or a different way, and this has fascinated me for a long time. Very often, most of us think of time as given, certainly I do. It's measured by how fast we revolve around the sun or some other regular frequency event, atomic clocks, whatever you want to do. So we think of time as given in a backdrop. Other people think of time as emerging. Change comes out of time, is one point of view. Time really emerges from change, and we had 2 or 3 speakers mention this yesterday. And characteristically, by the way, Plato believed in time as given, idealist, time as some ideal, it's there in the background. Aristotle thought of time as emerging from change. Isaac Newton thought of time as given, and he did a lot of writing and thinking to justify that. His contemporary and arch enemy, Leibniz, thought of time as emerging. And I think it's a matter of temperament, which you do. I'm a Leibniz guy. I don't like Aristotle much, but I'll go with Leibniz. Let me give you this thought experiment as another thought experiment. We imagine a universe. That universe exists somehow. Laws of physics are suspended, so there's no beta decay, there are no electrons whirring around. Nothing's happening. Absolutely nothing. We do away with gravity. We can set up this thought experiment any way we want. And I notice, by the way, people not trained in science say, well, that's impossible, so we can't consider it. We're not considering the possible. We're just doing, running through a set of ideas in our mind. By the way, the one discipline that's given most heavily to thought experiments, we usually think of that as physics, but actually it's mathematics. If you're doing real mathematics, you're saying, well, what if I took this to the limit? What if I zeroed this out? What if this were infinite? What if we did it in a different space? What if we transformed it from here into there? So you're doing all these what-if experiments and exploring. Anyway, back to the lab idea. So there's nothing happening in this universe, and we wipe out the idea that there are other universes nearby where something is happening. So nothing is happening. It's just there. It's a bit like being dead, by the way. If you're alive for a finite time. If you're dead, you're going to be dead for a long time, and there isn't much happening, at least not to you. So in this universe, there's nothing happening. My question is, if nothing happens, how would you measure time? There's no way to measure it. How would you know a year has passed? You wouldn't. Time in such a place that nothing happens would be not well defined. In fact, you could argue, if you think about this long enough, that there's no such thing. Nothing's happening, it's just there. After 10 seconds, nothing's happening. But where did the 10 seconds come from? How do you know it's not 10 million years? So the point I want to make, I just want to shake our ideas a little bit up. There is no such universe, but it is a thought experiment that suggests to me that time emerges from change. And I think this is not an idea we're very comfortable with. Philosophers call time that emerges from change relational time. There's another word, I think, substantive time, for the Newton's time that's sort of, no matter what we do, clock is ticking, if there is such a clock. Okay. So let me talk about economics, because this pertains to economics. If you look at the great economists from 1776, Adam Smith, on through to about 1870, they were all concerned with change, with structural change. Adam Smith wrote an awful lot about the economy, developing, changing, changing its structure, changing its character. Karl Marx, who I respect as a wonderful economist, very thoughtful. He's not popular, by the way, in the West, but a fantastically good economist. He thought of one stage leading to the next, as you know, one era leading to another one, deterministically, and he lived in the 1800s, after all. Other economists, Ricardo and other ones, thought of time as being there. The economy changes in structure. The economy changes in pattern. And then something happened around the 1870s to about 1900. Economists discovered that they could follow physics and take a lot of economics and put it in equation form. And that was fine, but to shoehorn it into that, what they had to do was express everything in economics as nouns, so there wouldn't be events, triggering events, there'd be nouns, there'd be prices, quantities produced, quantities consumed by households, etc. And they started to look at the economy, borrowing from physics, as a set of forces. The forces would be incentives to produce, price incentives, and they started to figure out what would be the pattern of things produced and the pattern of prices that would emerge. But they couldn't say, they couldn't easily say in the 1880s, this will be produced, this will give incentives for somebody else to do something, which will trigger this, which will switch off that. That wasn't the thinking of the 1880s. Moreover, they couldn't easily handle that. It was far too complicated. So they settled that they would only look at things in equilibrium, a bit like a spider's web. A spider's web is in a very finely constructed equilibrium. It's rather beautiful. The economics that emerged out of borrowing from physics and making economics equation-based as opposed to story-based or history-based turned out to require that all producers and consumers were in some magic way alike. They had similar tastes, they simplified things. It required that we're only talking about goods, services. They wouldn't have talked about services and prices and so on. And everything was going to be magically in equilibrium. In some way, this was wonderful because it gave us an incredibly beautiful general equilibrium theory. The idea was transferred into game theory about 60 years later. The idea was transferred even into forecasting and what we call in economics expectations. What would be the right forecast given any information, say in the Wall Street Journal, that would produce prices for assets, for stocks, that would induce buying and selling behavior that would give back the same prices on average. That's called rational expectation. Point is that equilibrium came to dominate everything, and that came to be the central theory of economics from about 1890 until now, probably until 2030 or so. Point is, time in that disappears. If everything's in equilibrium, the spider's web is there. There may be a few gusts rattling it around, making it oscillate a bit, but there's nothing much happening, and time disappears. Here's one of my favorite economists, Joan Robinson, 1973. I'll read you the quote. Once we admit that an economy exists in time, that history goes one way from the irrevocable past into the unknown future, the conception of equilibrium becomes untenable. The whole of traditional economics needs to be thought out afresh. So that's a real challenge. I like Joan Robinson because she has, I can't say what the word here, let's just say she has guts. So she's amazing. By the way, I was standing outside a conference in 1980. It was in Mexico City. I was a very young economist. Standing next to me outside the door was this older man. He looked to me to be about 80. Maybe he was 60 or whatever. He came over and introduced himself, very distinguished looking in English. And he says, by the way, the name is Austin. He says, Austin Robinson. So I said, oh, you're the husband of Joan Robinson? He says, no, I'm Robinson the economist. Anyway, he was the husband of Joan Robinson, but he didn't, he preferred to think, he was a very good economist. So what she's saying is that if there's just equilibrium, there isn't structural change. We're not seeing new eras. We're not seeing new patterns. There's just nothing happen. And I remember John Holland, one of the very first things he taught me, among many, many things, in 1987, I was on and on about equilibrium. Finally, he cut through and he says, Brian, he says, an equilibrium is dead. There's nothing happening. There's nothing being created. So economics, in some way, I admire equilibrium economics. That's what I was taught. So I have to put all of this politely and say, it's given us an enormous amount of insight into the economy, but at a price. If you accept equilibrium, nothing happening, all these forces are perfectly balanced, then you're ruling out a lot of things that happen in real economies. There isn't really change, there isn't exploration, there isn't adjustment, there isn't adaptation, there isn't creation, there isn't a sort of messy vitality in life. So a lot of economists, like Joan Robinson, myself and many others, think, well, yeah, it kind of gets somewhere, but where is the life in the economy? Where are things just popping up? Where are things emerging? Where are things disappearing? And so there's been a very general moving away a bit from equilibrium and still locked in to thinking, surely we can do something different. And what I want to describe is one way of thinking about the economy, not in equilibrium. So the question I want to ask, how do these eras arise in economics? And in a way, they mark time in economics. I was fascinated by Doug's talk, Doug Irwin. I don't know if he's Doug. Oh, there's Doug. Paleobiology is not measured by the clock much. You saw Doug's diagram. It's measured by patterns. We have the Cretaceous. We have the Permian period. Then something happens. Just about everything gets wiped out. Something comes back. That's a new era. So an era is a time where there might be a consistent pattern that's steadily changing. Like the Cambrian period, it may be changing very fast, but it's one era after another. Moreover, you can't predict what's going to come next. And Winston Churchill was once asked about history. He fancied himself as a historian, so somebody asked him to define history. Churchill thought for a bit. He says, history. He says, history is one damn thing after another. So it's one, what I'm looking for is, can we talk about eras in the economy as one damn thing after another? I believe we can. Oh, by the way, yeah, this is where I started. This is a historian. I'd call him Niall Ferguson. He mispronounces his name as Neil Ferguson. He's a super, super bright guy at Oxford, now at Stanford, or depending on the day of the week, he might be in London School of Economics or wherever. He shuttles around. He's kind of the definition of what in Britain we call a teledion. A teledion is a don, that is a fellow of some college in Oxford or Cambridge, who appears regularly on television. I don't want to put him down. He fascinates me because he's really bright. And he was wondering, if you're talking about eras, and you could say the West, sometime between 1500 and the year 2000, reached what we now call modernity. All the patterns changed. What drove that? Here's his answer. He said there were 5 killer apps. One was killer apps, meaning that drove all this structural change. Well, we had competition in the West. There were people setting up companies. It wasn't top-down by fiat. It wasn't large plantations. Science, of course, must have, let me bow to that. Science must have kicked in. Property rights were brought over, say, to America from England, that if you own something, then you could get the proceeds from owning that, say, like a factory, consumer society, etc., and the work ethic. So hats off to Protestantism and Max Weber. I read this list and I thought, well, hang on a moment, let me single out science. Science did not affect the economy, particularly the attitudes might have, until well after 1850. Dams were built, big, not hydroelectric ones, but huge dams across gorges were built based on experience and craft and knowledge until 1850. Then theories began to be developed. Similarly, science didn't affect most of technology or the economy until after the 1900s. Early radios were built. Lee De Forest, for example, had a PhD from Yale in physics, but he didn't know really what he was doing with the triode vacuum tube. All his science wasn't of much use. So I think something else drove the changes in the West, and I would say it's technology stupid. Under Clinton, we had this thing, it's the economy stupid. But what's behind the economy? It's really technology. Now, I'm not trying to convince you, I'm going to show you what I mean by that. The standard view is that there's something you'd call the economy. So it's like a big container or a big machine. Think of it as a big power station. So it's the economy, it's a container, and it contains its technologies. This is the way I was taught economics at Berkeley. There's the economy, and then you could slide in new technologies and slide them out. So you put in this module, let's call it the Bessemer process, 1875, and then slide that out again. And then maybe a bit later, you have the open hearth process, and you slide out the Bessemer process, slide in open hearth, and then you pull that out and you put in the basic oxygen process. This is all for making steel. And so the economy contains its technologies. There's successive inventions, and the innards of the economy are changed. That's very much the picture. Oh, where do the inventions come from? Well, you know, and this is where economics gets hand-wavy. Where do the inventions come from? Well, ask me next time. Where they come from? Creativity? Huh? Where does the creativity come from? Well, that's kind of indefinable. So economics didn't, I'm sorry, I'm being very harsh on economics, but this is several decades of pent-up frustration. So the economy contains its technologies, and these change by successive inventions. I spent a long time from the mid-90s until 2009 thinking about technology and writing a book. I came to a very different conclusion. The book, by the way, is The Nature of Technology. It exists in Chinese, Japanese, Italian, and God knows what else, Turkish maybe. And it has a pretty wide readership. So my thing I want to say is the economy doesn't contain its technologies. The economy forms from its technologies. You could say an ecology, We're back in Doug territory here. And an ecology contains its species. No, it doesn't. An ecology is an expression of its species. It forms from the species that are interacting within it. The economy forms from its technologies. This isn't a shocker. This is what the classical economists up until 1870 thought. An economy, somebody like Schumpeter would have said, and did say, an economy is an expression of the productive means, meaning the industries and technologies that were forming that economy. And so you see whole patterns of technologies that are consistent. They form, they change, they disappear, they give way to new patterns. A bit like clouds form, and then they change their shape over time. I don't want to get too poetic here. And then they dissipate, and then new clouds come along and take their place. So this is something that you can see already isn't going to be easily reduced into equations. And for that reason, plenty of economists have thought this way. Patterns of technology form, change the economy. That's why the English economy in 1850 was quite radically different from the economy of the Trobriand Islands, because they had very different technologies, different ideas, thoughts, attitudes. I don't want to oversimplify, but patterns of technology form, change, dissipate, and are replaced. I want to show you an example of this. It's the Industrial Revolution, which happened in Britain first, specifically in England, in the roughly between earliest you could say is about 1760 on through, I'll let it run through the 1950s or more. I want to talk about what happened. This is a bit before 1760. I dug this out of the Encyclopedia from Denis Diderot and d'Alembert in France. So it's mid-1700s. Everybody's interested in knowledge. We've had this great change we call the Enlightenment. There's an enormous interest in reason and in what we would now call information, huge interest in knowledge and gaining knowledge, huge interest in disseminating knowledge and forming it or ordering it. And of course, it's the French that are leading the way at about this time. And they started to say, well, look, we're going to look at even the trades, how things are manufactured, and we'll put that in our encyclopedia. Now, I looked at this pretty carefully. It's obviously a lathe. I just came across the image on the internet. There's a guy turning something on the lathe. To turn the lathe, there's this big wheel. This guy's doing the carving. This one's probably sharpening the chisels or knives that are required. Everything was clean and tidy, notice. I don't know if that's true in France all the time. Where I come from, it's not true. There's no sawdust. Things are getting worked on, but there's no waste, there's no sawdust. And what struck me about this is it was very clean, incredibly simple. There's just a wheel getting turning this cylinder that the guy's working on with a chisel by hand. I would call this craft. And this is the way economies worked at the time worldwide. China had similar technologies, so did Persia, so did the Arab countries, all of these. In fact, I remember going to Syria in the 1970s, and sure enough, somebody had something like a bow drill. It could turn by hand or foot, and then something was turning, and he was working on it. This is still in the late 70s, with a chisel by hand. So this isn't really the Industrial Revolution. This is pre-Industrial Revolution. What happened? Look at this. Whoop. Oh, yeah. Sorry. This is a commentary. sometime around the 1760s, and I haven't looked into this to figure out the detective work on this, but there was a different mood entered technology and science. It was a mood that emphasized rationality and precision, a mood that emphasized refinement. You could improve technologies. You didn't have to use a technology that had been used for 1,000 years. You could actually work on it and improve it. And it was this thought, apart from, again, I don't want to oversimplify the Industrial Revolution. There were changes in what economists would call factor prices. Energy, coal, charcoal became cheap. Labor became expensive, so it paid you if you could make machines. But take a look at the difference. There's about 30 years of difference. This is around 1780. Samuel Crompton's mule. It's called a mule because it was on runners. So that was one sort of technology, and then there was basically a spinning wheel. So on one shunt down here, cotton thread, raw cotton would be twisted into thread, and then on the reverse, it would be wound around a bobbin or somewhere so that you got finished cotton. Crompton, if this had been 30 years before, Sam Crompton would have sort of said, okay, we have spinning wheels, maybe we can do something about that. But notice what's happened. Look at all the very intricate cog systems here. Look at the wheels. Look at the adjusters. There's even a tension weight here. There's another cogged wheel, etc. It took him about 20 years to do this. He tried to get a patent on it. The patent was refused. Once it worked pretty well, it was ripped off by Richard Arkwright, who did get a patent on it. Crompton brought a lawsuit and won, and he was given a compensation of £5,000. Now, in the 1780s, that wouldn't have been too bad. He lived on into the 1800s. What I want you to notice is the intricacy and the very techiness of all of this. It's not just one guy turning a crank and another, using a chisel. Technology itself has changed. And I wondered how he got these cut precisely. Turned out that precision machine tools that would have been able to cut, I don't know if this is metal or wood, likely metal, came along in the 1770s. So this was the latest edition of his mule with beautifully, probably very precisely cut cog wheels. Here's another one. James Watt steam engine, 1781. This is kind of certainly not the beta version. This is quite highly developed. James Watt, incidentally, didn't invent the steam engine. He was a very good scientific instrument maker. Around 1765 at the University of Glasgow, where he was the instrument maker, one of the professors said, we had the steam engine. It was a Newcomen engine from about 1712. We have a version of this. Do you think you could improve it? So notice improvement coming up. Watt couldn't improve it. And he thought a lot about it, and it nagged him. And in May 1765, and I remember this is from his biography, and it was quoting what he wrote in his diary, and he says, and I was walking, he says, on the Sabbath by the village green, and it occurred to me that if you put in a separate condenser, it's a bit technical, but rather than have the whole idea is you put in steam here that raises the piston, which turns wheel, etc. But on the way back, it's still hot and you're losing a lot of energy. So his idea was to withdraw the steam into something that would always be cool. And the whole thing increased the efficiency of the steam engine unbelievably. So there's James Watt. He gets the idea. He's walking on the village green. It's the Sabbath day. He sees how to do this thing. But he couldn't go to his lab and do it because it's the Sabbath. It's okay. He couldn't do it because it's the Sabbath. So this almost kills him, you know. God, you know. So probably at midnight, he's back in his workshop trying to figure this out. But it worked. And this is one of the unbelievable moments of technology. By 1781, and he couldn't find ways to bore the piston because the precision machine tools of the day weren't up to it. But as I said, they arrived around 1775, and so all of this is working. What I want you to notice about this is that it's very much a combination. So is Crompton's mule, so is any technology. There's a flywheel here, there's beams here, there's a crank, which James Watt was able to install the year before. There's condensers, there's pistons. All these parts were known. And what James Watt did was to put them together. So it's a bit like doing Sudoku or a bit like working with Lego. James Watt wanted to have a decent steam engine. How did he do it? Well, from the whole Lego parts of wheels, cranks, levers, etc. There's even a Watt's governor in here. I love looking at this thing because the more you stare at it, you see how the whole thing worked and what was new and what wasn't. I don't want to say that the Industrial Revolution was just those two technologies. What I want to point out is what really happened here. So here's my version of what happened. This is way oversimplified because there was a huge amount going on in Britain at the time. Prices were changing, ideas were changing. But just think, to understand this, we're interested in improvement, we're interested in precision. We have a new killer app, and that is textile machinery. The textile machines were run not by the steam engine, it wasn't quite good enough then. They were run by water mills. So then you had to have a mill pond, big water wheel would turn, that would turn some power source that would be used in the textile machinery. So to go back to how the era changed, and I'm just using this as an example, the era changed because at the start of the era, in England and Scotland, they had something for textiles called the putting out system. I might be a spinner. If I were, I'd be female, or I might be a weaver. Probably if I were, I'd be male. But either way, you were given raw cotton or wool, raw wool, and you could spin it into thread, or you could weave it into cloth. And you were given stacks of this. You could do this in your spare time on your loom or on your spinning wheel. And somebody would pick up the finished material, pay you, and then give you more raw material, and you could keep doing this. When machines came along, they didn't fit that system. The machines called for a higher scale. In fact, if you were going to do this properly, you needed something that was called a manufactory, or came to be called a factory, or a mill. So suddenly there was a call for mills. Then mills, larger rooms with many such machines, many people attending them, those were built. But hang on, when you get mills, you need workers. There weren't enough workers, so workers were drawn in from agriculture. Well, hang on, where are the workers going to sleep? Oh, they slept in dormitories or in worker housing. So suddenly, from this putting out system of cottages and villages, there was mills, the dark satanic mills, if you want. I think that's Blake. There were mills, and there were workers. Where I grew up in Belfast, we called them millies. The millies would come out of the mills at 5 or 6 p.m. And you had a call for a new type of labor force, needs for worker housing and so on. And that called forth yet more technologies. So we went from a system that looked like this. The lighting isn't very good here. This is rather bucolic. It's 1819. This is a painting by John Constable. But notice how rural it is. This is before the mills took over. There's a beautiful book, by the way, I can recommend, written about the 1920s by an Englishman called George Sturt, S-T-U-R-T. It's called The Wheelwright Shop. There's technologies in this, but they're not that simple. Someone like Sturt would point out that the wood here and the spokes would have to be different from the wood and the rim. If you look somewhere else, again, I'm sorry it's not a wonderful image, you might see a water wheel here. There's horses, etc. So there is a consistent pattern or a consistent technology. What happens, though, as time passes? This is 30 to 40 years later. This is, God knows where, Manchester maybe, or somewhere like that. And I do remember when I grew up in Belfast, we were on the outskirts of Belfast, an elevated territory. I could look down over town and you'd see all the horrible black smoke, all gone, but having to do with steam engines. So this is around 1850. The previous thing, 1819 is the year Queen Victoria was born. 1850, she's well into her reign, but she's reigning over all of this. The conditions were abominable. Safety was non-existent, so that set up a need for further safety systems, for further institutions. All that labor force was sort of being ground. Just read Charles Dickens or read Karl Marx by the 1850s. So labor unions formed, the workers started. So new institutions formed. What I want to do here is to draw some conclusions from this. How do eras form? I don't want to oversimplify, but here's the bones of my argument here. A new technology comes along and forms by combination. So that's a bit like Crompton's mule. All the parts are already there, cogwheels, runners, twisters, all these sorts of things. So a new technology is formed by reaching into the Lego blocks of existing things and putting something new together. That technology may replace existing technologies, maybe all over the place. The textile machinery in due course replaced the spinners and weavers and putting out system. It sets up needs for further technology. Once you get these new textile machines, you scale them up, and you need the technology of factories and factory floors and timing, workers clocking in and clocking out. And then the factories call for dormitories, etc. The new technology becomes available to be used in further combinations. Well, James Watt's steam engine was certainly used all over the place in factories and in trains. And the economy, whatever we're calling this new pattern, has changed. And back to standard economics, the prices and incentives would thoroughly readjust. What I want you to notice about this is, I wrote this, by the way, in my book, Nature of Technology, and I thought this was brilliant. And I thought this is going to make a huge impact. And then a friend of mine was looking at the book, I won't say who, but a really good economist at Oxford, whom you know, I'm sure. And he says, Brian, he said, brilliant, absolutely incredible stuff. It was a mixture of history and complexity, technology. But he says, it's not scientific. I said, what do you mean it's not scientific? He says, well, where are the equations? If you can put this in equation form, it'll be scientific. Well, I harumphed, and I was really miffed. Miffed enough to start to think about this. Look at this. A new technology forms by combination. It may replace, so these are all actions, sets up needs, becomes available. That's not quite an action, but further combinations follow. Prices readjust, verbs. This is an algorithm, and it's a very special type of algorithm. Why? Because if a new technology forms, suddenly it's available for further combinations. You get the triode vacuum tube. It's available for further combinations, maybe as a relay in a relay circuit with other components. Those further combinations are new technologies. So this action is setting up further actions, replacing existing technologies, hats off to Mr. Schumpeter, and sets up further needs for new technologies. So you have an ecology where things are triggering things, things are replacing things, things are switching off things, things are switching on new things. Everything is changing qualitatively. We have new entities, we have factories, etc. And they're all creating a new ecology that we call the economy. Let me work you through this. I looked at this. I love this picture, by the way, because it's an early train. And it's got a locomotive. Just before this, before 1825, it would have had a horse, maybe even two horses. The Stockton-Darlington Express in 1825 consisted of one carriage and 12 horses to run and relay. If you're old enough, and I'm not old enough, you might remember horse-drawn omnibuses in London in the early 1900s. But this is a standalone locomotive. The locomotive is already there. It consists of parts from the Lego box, wheels, linkages, a boiler, chimney, something to power it, etc. And look at what in English we call carriages. Americans call these cars, railroad cars. We call them railway carriages. These were carriages. You just take the wheels off and you run it on rails. There's not much friction. So an early train had a locomotive, and then just like a woman's cloak, like Queen Victoria, there was a train behind it, a train of carriages, like a following of carriages. So I reckon this is about 1832, 1833. I might be off by a year or so, but it's pretty early. And these people are just sitting in their carriages up above, enjoying the view. So this technology comes a long, serious way around 1830. What does it do? Go back to our algorithm. It forms by combination. It may replace existing, it sure replaced horse-drawn railways, but in due course, it built out and it replaced the canal system. It sets up needs for further technology. Once you have railways and railway carriages, you need steel. You need steel factories, you need serious steel works, you need organizations for the station, you put together a railway, your further needs, stations need to signal each other, so you have a need for something that came to be called the telegraph around 1841, very quickly after railways. Becomes available to be used for further combinations. Well, for sure, the railway became part of goods transportation system. I wandered into the Stanford archives almost by chance a long time ago, maybe 20 years ago, researching railways, and I came across a broadsheet from about 1834. It was called The Economist magazine and Railway Gazetter. And of course, it's The Economist magazine we know today. Every bit as superior and patronizing as its counterpart today. This is people who knew, who were handing down. But the wisdom to the masses who could read. But it talked about a new economy. If you wanted to get goods from London to Bristol, Bristol was the big shipping center, you had to put them on ox carts, and it would take 2 to 3 weeks to get to Bristol. And The Economist magazine was going, oh, wow. They didn't say, oh, wow. They said, oh, wonderful. We will be able to ship goods from London to Bristol or vice versa in 3 to 4 hours. It was a killer app. And they used the phrase, and I was reading this around 1999, I think. To my delight, they were using the phrase, we have a new economy. And if you remember 20 years ago, the idea of a new economy was a huge thing. But the point is, they were right. This was a new economy. It was a completely different world. And the last thing, the economy is different. Prices and incentives readjust. I want to point out 1 or 2 things about this. Let me go back to the algorithm here. New technology forms by combination. Notice something about this algorithm. It's not a kind of one thing after another. There may be many new technologies in parallel. In parallel with the steam engine came, and a bit after it came the steam railways. In parallel with that, there were many other things happening. There's textile machinery. So the whole economy is suddenly alive. You're getting technologies replaced. Horses disappeared. Eventually, when the automobile came along, and with them, what disappeared were horse depots, serious blacksmiths, there are still a few left, horse feeding operations, horse brass manufacturing, anvil makers, etc., and becomes available for further combinations. So if you have the imagination, which I'm sure you have, allow this algorithm to become alive in your mind. So we have new technologies forming. Simultaneously, further combinations of that new technology is forming. Transistor appears in 1950 or so, and then suddenly it's part of further combinations, electronic circuits. And those circuits are available, and they're running through the same algorithm. And they're transistors replacing vacuum tube technology, and is setting up needs for further technologies. Transistors set up huge needs for clean rooms, for understanding how layers could be deposited, for new types of material science, and understanding actually at the quantum level. And so this algorithm, if you like, is executing at huge scales, at small scales, at big scales, at all scales in between. And that's what fascinated me about Doug's talk yesterday, was that things were happening at all scales. Time was smeared out. Yes, there were huge changes, big era changes, but within those, almost fractally or recursively, are smaller changes happening and still smaller changes happening. Because if you have any given technology, say like that, then you need technologies for the steel. At first this was cast iron, eventually it became steel, etc. That technology came online, and that went through the same algorithm. So what I want to point out is that this algorithm is not once only every 50 years. This algorithm is going on at many levels all the time, concurrently, to use a computer science phrase, and it's setting up needs. Those needs are there all the time, and then they're fulfilled. New technologies come along, and they set up yet further needs, and the whole thing never stops. So this led me to thinking that technology follows something I call combinatorial evolution. It's not Darwinian evolution. There's plenty, once a good technology is set up, like railways, there is plenty of variation and selection, and engineers have noticed this since Darwin's book came out. But this is something different. This is the existing Lego block, your Lego set, the existing elements combined to give you novel entities. If we're creating novel entities these days, we do them out of pieces of algorithm, or we do them out of solid state chips or something like that. Some of these, they're not put together randomly usually in society. Some of those, if they turn out to be useful, they survive. And you toss them into the Lego set for further combination. And then that means that what's available and the resulting economy forms a context for further selection of yet more novel combinations. I don't know if Stefan is here, but he and I and a guy called Rudi Hamel in Austria are working on a version of combinatorial evolution, an application of this algorithm where we're trying to develop from primitive circuits, press the return button, and we're developing a version of this algorithm that will put together and result in a programmable computer. It's super ambitious. I don't want to say we've achieved this yet, but it's great fun. And I can say, watch this space. This will be done at the hub. The last observations I want to make on this is that the kind of change I'm talking about here is the appearance of this affects that, sets up new needs, replaces that. This is, I wouldn't say it's totally Boolean, but it's event-driven. This event drives that changes this. This switch flips off. There's no more horse rage. This switches on. Again, I don't want to make it too cut and dried. It's certainly not deterministic because you don't know what's going to come along next. But it's very difficult to formalize in equation forms, in spite of what my Oxford friend says. And I began to wonder why it was so difficult. Really, science doesn't easily work with novel, different entities. You can't write a set of equations saying we have all these things, we more of them or less of them, they're priced this way, they work that way, and oops, we get a steam engine. Ooh, okay, let there be a new variable for the number of steam engines. It doesn't work very well. Fine. But if you think algorithmically, then obviously this can be handled as an algorithm. That led me to think, and this is, don't pin me to the wall on this one, but I began to realize that there are noun-based and verb-based sciences in a kind of a spectrum. A noun-based science would be, say, physics in the 1880s, before 1900, which is describable in nouns. Well, we have these ions, or we have these atoms, we have various elements, say, in a gas or molecules. There's position, it's a noun, there's velocity, there's momentum, there's temperature, etc., etc. And we can describe the relations between these things. What would be a verb-based science, or what I call a procedural science? Pretty well all of modern biology. Modern biology isn't saying we've more lemurs and, well, actually sometimes it does, the Lotka-Volter equations, if you know those. We have more, what are they called, snowshoe hares, and we have whatever hunts those things, wolves or something, and that oscillates. But mostly biology is event-driven, especially at the molecular level. Doug was talking about genetic regulatory networks. Those are things that switch other processes on, like a subroutine, switch some off. They can be described via circuits. If this is on and that's on and this is not on and that's, then switch this process on. So mitosis genetic regulatory networks, gene copying, all the tools of genomics, those are all process-based. Notice that you can't easily put these processes forming new entities into equations. If you could, you'd be able to say, all right, we'll start our equations just before whatever hit in the 65 million years ago. Then something hits, and then we will be able to forecast what sort of species emerge and what numbers emerge. And of course, you can't do that. Darwinism, or even most of molecular biology, or genetic regulatory networks, can't easily be handled in equations because there's not numbers, they're not little volumes and test tubes, colored liquids going up and down like they would in a noun-based science. There are events triggering events that switch off events and switch on other events. You can't quite say when. There's something else about this. In noun-based, you have to have something at the back of all these levels of things changing, something you could call time, and that's where absolute time is. Verb-based, this brings into being this, creates that, and that creates something else. Time is much more emergent in this sort of thing. So noun-based is handled by equations. Verb-based is normally handled by algorithms. How does that apply in economics? And I want to finish up here, Jan. I started to think about economics, this might have been 3 or 4 years ago, and I realized that there are two groups of problems in economics. Think of these as two big themes. One is what economists would call allocation, general equilibrium theory, traditional game theory, international trade theory, stock market theory. Those are all levels, prices, amount of trade, amount produced, amount consumed. These are nouny things. They have been mathematized up to the gills, and quite sophisticated mathematics as well. And so from the 1870s until today, this now forms the core of economics. Anything else that you could have called economic development, that's events, bringing further events like I was showing in the Industrial Revolution, innovation, structural change, whole patterns changing, how do institutions emerge like safety laws, insurance, etc. That can't be easily mathematized, so it wasn't really mathematized. But these are event-driven, these are procedural, and I think this is the area that complexity economics looks at best. This is the area that standard equation-based economics looks at best. This is algorithmic, and by the way, the people who do this, economic development, institutions, etc., are regarded as they're economic historians. I can do the body language. I mean, this is having been at Berkeley and then Stanford. Luckily, I could do this sort of stuff, but it didn't interest me. Now we can do all this, but algorithmically, we can, because complexity is all about formation and putting structures together and structures changing, patterns emerging, so we can start to talk to these people who really do economics. Who are they? Thorsten Veblen. Unfortunately, all these people are dead. The great Schumpeter, who's I think the patron saint of the Complexity Hub in Vienna, Austrian, and rightly so, I should say. I don't want to be cynical. George Shackle, von Hayek, another Austrian. They thought about formation, they thought about change, they thought about history, they thought about structural change. What I want to point out is I don't know how things work here at NTU. I took about 4 or 5 years of economics at Berkeley at the PhD level. I never heard any of these people mentioned, not once. Not once. I'll say it again. never, not once, some of the inferior types who thought about history would have read this. In fact, my mentor, Kenneth Arrow, was an expert on history of economic thought. And he was regarded as slightly eccentric because he delved into people who really thought the economy. So let me finish here by saying that time emerges from given new entities being formed by combination from existing ones, at least in the economy, but more generally in biology as well. And as Francois Jacob pointed out quite a long time ago, this brings new structures, but it brings new niches or new needs, and that calls out further combinations and new pattern forms. And finally, I think all of this fits pretty well with what I perceive as a shift in all the sciences. Greg Chaitin talks about this, and I think he was here a year or so ago. Around 1900, pre-Max Planck, we would have said that the way we look at the world is highly ordered. We're looking for order. We are using heavy formalisms. We tend to see things as determinate, although that was starting to relax by then. We see a number of fixed elements, more of this, less of that. And things are largely in stasis or in some form of equilibrium, and in that sense, time is absent if things are in stasis. But we're not much looking at formation. Nowadays, all the sciences and mathematics and economics are shifting to organicism. One thing builds from another, one thing's built on another. Contingency, if that small event hadn't happened, we wouldn't have got this new structure. Indeterminacy, we don't know what I'm not Jeff, so I can't get away with words like this, what the bleep is coming next. So we've indeterminacy, and that means we can't well formulate economic problems. We don't know what's happening. I live in Silicon Valley, nobody knows what's coming next. Evolutionary openness, meaning we're getting new things all the time, redefining what the ecology is, and in that sense, time is emerging. Economics is still largely here. It's totally inevitable it will shift to there. Unfortunately, I'll be dead, but you might live to see this. Here's a lovely metaphor that I like. Dave Collender, who's a good friend of mine, remarked quite a while ago that this is a metaphor. He said, economists in the 1850s were standing at the bottom of two mountains, but the mountains were covered by a low layer of cloud. They didn't know which one to climb. One mountain was the mountain of well-definedness of order, balance, and timelessness. And I threw in timelessness, order, balance, equilibrium, not much happening. And so they climbed that one. That was the one that looked more scientific. The other, when they got to the top, they were above the clouds and they discovered there was another mountain that was higher. That's the mountain of ill-definedness, everything forming, changing, structural change, organicism. I threw in procedures here, but verbi-based, things triggering things, and of time emerging. I really love Dave's metaphor, and I think it sums up everything I'm trying to say here. Thank you very much. Sorry.
Thank you, Brian. I love the way you use stories to make your story. It's fantastic. Questions? One, two, or many? John.
Yeah. So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about what I call the institutional power of economists and their databases, because teaching classes of modeling that are not economic modeling or econometric model students have been trained at the NUS, and they say, well, if you're going to build a model, you have to have data. If you don't have data, you can't build a model. And I say, where does the data come from? Well, you know, the World Bank collects it. I mean, you need GNP, for example. That's important. And too much institutional power seems to have been generated by data that has been collected to solve yesterday's problems. And I wonder the degree to how to attack this edifice most effectively, although you've touched upon the problem, but, you know, translate that into action plans.
I think you're in danger here of lighting a powder keg. I would love to take what you said, one sentence, collecting data to whatever it was, to validate or to explicate yesterday's problems. Sure, I'd like to frame that. I feel very strongly about this. I'm a theorist, by the way. It may not look like that, but because I've been looking at history. I don't see that all theories need data. The Reverend Malthus cooked up his theory, which I think is beautiful, essay, 1798. And I want to point out to our dear friend who was here yesterday, Mr. Wesson, I think, who that biologists and Darwin got his key idea from Malthus, who was an economist. He was the man who was saying we could do without economists. Maybe. So what happens, I think, is that what I noticed was I was trained as an engineer and then a mathematician, and then I became a demographer and economic development expert. In fact, I taught classes on human fertility to pre-med students at Stanford, unbelievably now. But what I noticed about economics is that, at least in America, it's a rather vicious profession. It's because the stakes, Pache, Henry Kissinger, the stakes are high. If you're a really good economist, you can be head of the World Bank, or you can be chief economic advisor, you could be president of Harvard or whatever. In economics, if you're really good at it, you can get a really top job, and it's fierce. So there are people putting themselves up, let's say, putting down others, etc. Demography, population studies, when I was in it, wasn't like that at all. It was a rather friendly profession. The Institute, I came up with an idea called increasing returns in the 1980s. It had to do with doing economics under positive feedbacks. And now that's the basic economics of Silicon Valley or high tech. I won't go into it, but I wrote a paper on it, and 1983 couldn't get it published. So I talked to an anthropology friend who was very insightful, a guy called Mike Thompson in IASA in Vienna. Thompson, I said, why am I not getting my paper published? And this is still to your point. He says, why should it be published? And I said, well, why shouldn't it be? It's, by the way, the same paper now has just crossed 10,000 citations. I eventually did get it published, and it's been noticed. But why should your paper be published? He says, so I said, can you explain this to me? He said, look, economics is this gigantic Greek temple. We need to rely somehow that the economy is going to look after us. And who are the high priests of the temple? The economic theorists. And then you come in to the temple, you sneak in at night, you leave old beer cans and cigarette butts all over the altar. Then you disappear, and you expect them to thank you. So I'm answering you by analogy, but your question is quite loaded. A model does not have to have data. And economists are in charge of something that unconsciously we care about, which is whether we're going to live or die. And so if somebody incredibly smart puts a 25% tariff on steel in a country because it doesn't know any economics, that's not good news. So it matters. But economics, it's a bit like the medical profession. It actually makes a difference to whether people live or die. I looked at the mortality statistics in Russia after Russia became a market economy. Boy, it was a big dip, huge dip, very visible. A lot of people, especially men, out of work and dying because of economic ideas. Oh, there'll be a new equilibrium in the Russian economy in 1991. It'll establish itself, and we can all be happy. Wasn't true. They didn't take into account all the adjustments, and there was 15 years of misery in Russia. Now it's asserted itself okay.
Correct.
Brilliant talk,
Thank you.
Brian. There's so many thoughts that you triggered that I don't know where to start. But I'm going to start with regulators, the economic regulators. Right now, there's a lot of innovation in the financial space, and there's a lot of fintech is such a popular term, and a lot of these are being formed into startups and various other kinds of things. One of the things that you have basically put across is that from one equilibrium to another, the path is uncharted.
Yes.
It's not known. And regulators tend not to look at that. Yeah. And the 2008 situation, I think, sort of came from that.
Yeah.
What is your view about, first of all, all these financial innovations? Do you see them as new technologies or ways of controlling existing technologies? And then what would you say to regulators who perhaps should be paying more attention to how stable is the path going to be to go from one equilibrium state to the other? I think that would be very interesting.
Thank you. By the way, Prof. Guaning Su brought me here to NTU, so blame him if you're an economist. But thank you. It's a lovely question. What we're seeing is a lot of new financial products, and these financial products are not nouny, they're actually verby. They're ones where you and I saw in Shenzhen last year, there was a new financial app you could put on your smartphone. You talk to your smartphone, and you can say, I don't think this is disclosing anything. You say, I would like to have $1,500. I don't have checks with me, and I want to buy something today. I'm in such and such a shopping mall. And 2 seconds pass, boom, it says credit for $1,500. What has happened is that you have apps that are recognizing your voice. They're testing whether it's really you. By pre-agreement, they're checking your bank account. What they're doing, etc., is conversing with other computers. Notice all of these are procedures. This triggers this triggers this, this triggers this. And then suddenly, within maybe 2 or 3 seconds, all of this gives you a yes or a no. No, we're not willing to up your credit line right now. You don't have enough backing, or you didn't pay very much in the last 2 years. We can't trust you. And then, boom, you get it. So what we're seeing, I think, is that these new financial applications are going to spell the end of retail banking. ATMs, cash machines, did in walking into a bank very largely around 1980. apps are going to do away. Certainly, we still use checks in the US, unbelievably. But in China, everybody just puts their smartphone down in a taxi or whatever. You hand it over, boom, it's done. I think that retail banking, deciding whether you're going to get a loan, whether you're going to get a mortgage, all of that's going to be done by AI. And so what I'm seeing is a new era come in, an era of intelligent algorithms or AI. I work at Xerox PARC in Palo Alto, and all my colleagues are working on applications either of machine learning or artificial intelligence. Can I show you one slide on that, Guaning, if I may, if Jan doesn't mind? The current revolution, and I'll go through this very quickly, is not one of computation. It's one of sensors. Your car, a driverless car, might have hundreds of sensors, including LiDAR, radar, cameras, imaging equipment, and they're everywhere and collecting data. Your smartphone is a sensor. It's sensing where you are, et cetera, collecting data. We'd call that big data. Algorithms are using the big data to make associations. So I walk past a camera in London Airport. It goes, it shows my face. Then algorithms say, oh, that's Brian Arthur. He's from Northern Ireland, be careful. In fact, with Brexit. So algorithms are using the data. They're making the association. That's so-and-so. Oh, okay, when he gets to the desk, we might give a bit of extra scrutiny. What I call associative intelligence emerges, meaning the kind of apps you're talking about, Guaning, are associative algorithms. Give me 1,500 Singapore dollars as line of credit in the next 2 hours. And they're associating you with your voice, associating you with certain bank accounts, with certain credit histories, and so on. Associative intelligence, if the neurobiologists will permit me here. Brilliant talk yesterday, by the way. Associative intelligence is a major part of how human beings work. It's not the only thing that our brains do, but we're really good at recognizing patterns. Oh, that's Uncle Jimmy, that's so-and-so. Oh, the last time I saw him, he was a pain in the behind. I better walk the other way, etc. And finally, that associative intelligence doesn't belong quite in our smartphones. It's out there. So I can be walking along. I need a new mortgage. I sort of hit the app. Can Wells Fargo give me a new mortgage? It's a one-bedroom apartment, say, in Palo Alto. Therefore, I'm going to need $1.2 million US for one-bedroom apartment. And then that goes through all this external intelligence, algorithms whirring away, and says yes or no. The external intelligence is something new, and I believe that that's akin with the printing revolution around about 1450 to 1550. Information became publicly available. Now intelligence, meaning discriminating, recognizing, associating, has gone external. It's become out there in the cybersphere, and for better or worse, we can use that. I believe, and this is part of what you're asking, what about the regulators? I believe we need to give serious thought to anything, absolutely anything that uses the algorithms associated. We do in medicine, we do in building codes. Well, why not in this area? And I think some of the key people I know in Silicon Valley are calling for more thought. The problem is that the people who are in position to give it more thought, regulators, politicians, thinkers, are not in a position to really know what's happening at all. So we're in a, and we don't know what's coming next.
Helga.
Thank you, Brian. I'm sure you know the work of David Edge, who is a bit of an iconoclast, a historian of technology, a bit like you. And David Edge wrote this book, The Shock of the New. And he says we are obsessed by, The Shock of the Old is the title of the book. So we are obsessed by novelty, we are obsessed by innovation, and we tend to overlook how the old persists.
Yeah.
So he gives example, perhaps not surprisingly, from the developing world, where you still have a lot of the old technology, but also from the US military,
yes.
where you would think they are at the forefront, but he shows how the old technology is incorporated, survives, etc.
Yeah.
Which brings me to the point I want to make. When you showed us the Industrial Revolution example, beautifully illustrated, it was a rather self-contained system. It started in England, but it took quite a while to be adapted to the rest of the world. And we remember in the 1950s, there was all this discussion about catching up. Other parts of the world were catching up until we got where we are now.
Yep.
We tend to think of a global technology, this is all global, a global economy. Yet we know there are still enormous differences.
Oh, yeah.
And just the shock of the old, when a few days ago, this bridge, a newly built footbridge, collapsed in Florida.
Yes.
You know, this is the shock of the old in a sense, because it illustrates you still need old technology, how to build bridges, how to make them safe in a world that is dominated and dominates our attention with these kind of examples that you give. And if you look at a huge continent like Africa, it's the informal economy that keeps people alive and keeps running, plus corruption. So you have this mixture of an enormous amount of corruption and the informal economy, which defines the economy in Africa. And you go to other parts and you find, again, a different kind of mixture. So instead of just focusing on the new era, I would like you to say a few more words about the differences that exist within such an era, and some of them carry also over to the next era, because there's an accumulation of advantages and disadvantages, as we know, which is all about path dependence, as you know very well.
Yeah. Thank you. I think you've answered most of what I would say already. Thanks for the detailed comment. One thing I want to say is I don't want to think that there's a homogeneous bunch of countries, that once you get textile machinery in Lancashire, that immediately it appears somewhere like Moscow or somewhere like that. As you said, it takes eons. There is a spatial component to the economy, and it takes eons to work itself out. Even now with globalization, which globalization is not a function so much of computing power, it's a matter of telecommunications. And telecommunications allows somebody in Seattle instantaneously in an architect's office to have the detailed drawings drawn up in Budapest or somewhere like that, or in China. So there is a huge spatial component. There's nothing, I hope, homogeneous about this. It's things triggering things, and if you had a map, you'd see things over time, even ideas, things like railways taking 50 or 100 years to work out. One of the fascinations I had was that when I started to look at technology is that it takes a long time. We tend to think that technology appears, there are adopters. Not true, not so much true. What is rarely the case is a new technology appears, the steam engine, or the electric motor in 1880. Industry doesn't adopt that. It encounters it. So we have all of industry at the moment in Singapore, or in America or Europe is encountering AI. And it's encountering it bit by bit, and it doesn't see how it can merge itself with the new possibilities. And is suspicious of the new possibilities. I took German lessons from a nun in Luxembourg who was born in 1891, and she told me that she could remember the coming of trains in parts of Austria, and that people initially said that the devil was riding on the locomotive. You know, this is a work of the devil. We have to be careful. I saw in the news this morning that the first rail fatality for driverless cars happened yesterday in Arizona. The first fatality of railway trains happened in 1841, so a kind of similar time lag. But we need to be careful. Also, I treasure old technologies. I like fonts, for example. I looked at, one of my favorites is Garamond. You might have that in your computer. I looked up Mr. Garamond. I thought, oh, 1980, some dude in a design office. Not at all. 1550 in Venice or somewhere like that. I like Caslon as well. These are what is true of old technology. I have to point here, not here. They are gritty. They have character, literally. It's fonts. Read George Sturt, The Wheelwright Shop. He talks about going out in the forest and say, this is a yew tree. Oh, and that bend there would just be perfect to get this supporting thing and this carriage I'm building. This is an elm tree. We want oak for this. We want the center of oak for that, and so on. Gorgeous stuff. I feel we're losing all that at the moment. I love old technologies, and there's kind of an irony. I'm slow to get technology. I'm about to buy my first smartphone in about 2 months. I'm not looking forward to it. I've held out, but I have kids, and I'm tired of being laughed at. So, but you're right. I believe in the old. When I was in Austria also, they had a children's show, and they were 2 or 3 times a week on television, and they were showing kids how industries worked, and like how do you make combs, and there were, it was incredibly old-fashioned, but there was something beautiful because it was craft. Very high-tech is craft too, but it's craft in a very abstract space.
Thank you very much.